To address the question of whether science and Christianity are friends or foes, I'm pleased to introduce to you tonight's guest lecturer, Dr. Se Kim. Se Kim is the Associate Director of the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, or the DOSER, program at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS. Everything's got to have an acronym, you know. That AAAS is the world's largest multidisciplinary scientific society. Their mission is to serve society by facilitating conversations between scientists and the largely religious public. Se oversees a variety of projects for the DOSER program and enjoys implementing projects and mobilizing stakeholders for the purposes of promoting science appreciation. Prior to AAAS, Se was a National Institutes of Health funded postdoctoral fellow at Rice University with a BS in biochemistry and PhD in molecular and human genetics. Se has research publications in the fields of genetics, neuroscience, and plant biology. She is currently also interested in nonprofit business management and pursuing an MBA degree at the University of Maryland. Would you please join me in welcoming tonight's Lumen Lecturer, Dr. Se Kim.
Whoa. Thank you for that introduction. So just a mic check, we're okay? We're good? Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Huggins, Chaplain Huggins, for this invitation, and to the Berry College family for this opportunity. It's really, really an honor for me to be here tonight with you all. Thank you. The echo was, I didn't know if it was just my ear. So the title of today's talk that Dr. Huggins gave me was Faith and Science, Friends or Foes. And so if you don't get anything out of this tonight, the bottom line is that they can be friends, so you can all get cookies and no. Please stay. I'd like to suggest an alternative subtitle, which in thinking about this is as a alternative title, a different way of seeing. And so I'll kind of elaborate on that as we go forward. And as I start, I kind of want to begin by doing a little bit of an introduction of myself. And where I come from, and such things. I'm originally from Texas. I currently reside in Washington, D.C., but I lived in Texas all my life. And so since we're talking, did I hear a whoop somewhere? Since we're talking about worldviews, a lot of faith and science conversations talk about worldviews. I thought I would share the worldview of Texans and the way that we see the map, which is, here we go. So yes, the great state of Texas. I'm very excited to be here in the state of Georgia. And I love coming to the South. I love coming back to the South because of, among many things like wonderful people, I love sweet tea. So I found a barrel of it somewhere in the roads of deep South in Texas, so I got super excited to take a picture. Also very excited to be here, joined not only by you in the audience, but my best friend, Ms. Jennifer Kennard, who's sitting in the audience right there. This is a picture of us when we were in 7th or 8th grade, and I'm not a mathematician, so I did the math, and it's about over a quarter of a century ago that picture was. So sorry to out you on our age, but friendships are a dear thing. I was raised in a Christian home, by first-generation Korean-American immigrants. So my parents are originally from South Korea, and I'm what they call 1.5 or a second-generation immigrant. And my parents are Christian, and they instilled in me Christian, I guess, thinking, but more so than this traditional thinking of going to church every Sunday. They were quite a bit of a naturalist, and so they really inspired in me the appreciation of beauty and the wonder of the world. So we used to just enjoy the outdoors, and this is a picture of my father after a long and arduous hike to the National Glacier. We didn't hike to the Glacier Mountains, but in the mountains we were hiking, and he was just taking it all in the majesty of it all, so we took a picture. And so from that, I think I grew up to appreciate the wonder, and that's probably why I became a scientist. This is a quote from John Muir. If you don't know who he is, he's a naturalist who was very fundamental in the formation of the national park system in the United States. He said, "No synonym for God is so perfect as beauty. Whether as seen carving the lines of the mountains with glacier, or gathering matter into stars, or planning the movements of water, or gardening, still all is beauty." And so I grew up in a Christian home and I defined myself as a committed follower of Jesus Christ, but I also became a scientist. And somewhere along the line, I found myself married to a pastor. And so this is a picture of me at Rice doing research around probably 1 or 2 in the morning. And my husband, being the good husband, godly husband that he is, he came with me at 2 in the morning to finish up some lab experiments and took one of the rare photos of me in lab. So that's great. And so, but it's really great. As you can imagine, our dinner conversation is a lot about science and religion. So it's very scintillating. And so I do this for professionally and on the personal side. So having done some research science down in Texas, I moved over to do a little bit more administration and really bringing forth science to the general public. So I joined AAAS, or the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And so I'll tell you a little bit about the association itself. Again, AAAS for short, is the world's largest general scientific membership society. It was founded in 1848, which I believe is maybe the second oldest, the other one being like a philosophy association. So it's really been around for a long time. It's most well known for publishing the science family of journals, and there's 5 families in the picture, but there's actually 7 now because we launched 2 this year in robotics and science advances. The best way to describe it is that for scientists, there's 2 most renowned journals where scientists can publish their research findings, Science being one, the other one will go unnamed. AAAS, no, it's Nature, but AAAS, in addition to publishing Science magazine, represents about 10 million scientists and science advocates worldwide. And the mission is really to bring science to the general public in service for society, so advancing science and serving society. It does this by a number of programs. Our program, the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, is one of them. There's other programs in government relations. There's programs in scientific responsibility and human rights. Anyone or anything that you can think of in education or any policy, we have it all at AAAS. And the DOSER program, or Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, is specifically geared towards carrying out AAAS's mission by bringing science to the religious public. And we do this by, as Dr. Huggins has mentioned, by facilitating the conversation between scientists and religious communities. You may wonder why AAAS takes on these kind of responsibilities. AAAS itself is a non-religious organization. Its sole mission is to advance science. But really, there was a recognition that science is, in order for it to be advanced, that it needs to engage with those that it's trying to serve. And the public is largely religious. So this is a quote from Dr. Alan Leshner, who was our CEO before Dr. Rush Holt took over in later 2015. But Dr. Leshner said, "A weakened science-society relationship not only undermines public support for science, but also makes it difficult for science to contribute to the solutions of society's problems." And so that kind of summarizes it really well. We do this by a number of projects, both at AAAS and around the country. We host symposia and workshops and public lectures. I like to say that my favorite part of the job is I get to ask all the fun questions in science without actually doing the research. And so it's really a fun place to be. We host events like Can Science Explain Everything, where we had physicists explain this. And we had an event on neuroscience, Did My Brain Make Me Do It? The issues of morality. So there's a lot of interesting things, and they're all on our website. And if you're looking for our website, I did bring some flyers, so feel free to pick them up, because I don't want to pick them back. So, but on our website, there's a lot of interesting talks, so if you're really keen on these kind of things, I encourage you to look them up. We have some really great events that we've recorded. In addition to public events, we do a number of projects, and they're really our flagship events throughout the year. Our current flagship project is engaging scientists in the science and religion dialogue. And this project is in response to a lot of the inquiries that we've had from the scientists themselves asking, how can we get engaged in this public discussion? And so the focus of the project is to support scientists who are interested in public engagement by providing science communication tools and resources for them to engage their audiences, whether it be students or general public, in recognizing that it may be constituted with largely religious folks. We have a project with religion reporters, and in fact, we just recognizing that media plays a significant role in the conversation of science and religion. And I just recently came back from Nashville, where they had their annual meeting, and we hosted a pre-conference event on artificial intelligence and the ethics behind artificial intelligence and the theological questions on those kind of things. We have projects for other religious non-Christian traditions, including Jewish communities, working with rabbis and synagogues around the country. And we have a large subset of projects on which I call science and theological education. So AAAS has found that many people, when they have questions about science, they actually don't go to a scientist. They go to their religious leaders. And so we partnered with the Association for Theological Schools, which is the accrediting body for seminaries and divinity schools in the United States or in North America. And we partnered with them, and we asked seminaries to integrate science into the curriculum for future clergy members. And so we want them to be equipped with the resources and people so that they know who to reach out to should they be faced with questions from their congregants. The last project I want to mention is a perceptions project, which I'll go into a little bit further throughout the talk. But the idea was twofold. First, we knew that there was this antagonism or perceived antagonism between science and religion in the country, and so we wanted to better understand it. So we partnered with a sociologist at Rice University and facilitated a national survey of Americans to really understand the tensions between science and religion. And we took the information from that survey to foster communication and dialogue between religious leaders, or particularly in this case, for evangelical pastors and non-religious scientists, which turned out really fabulous. So doing all this work, we have a wonderful team, which consists of scientists like myself, as well as those trained in communications and those trained in theology. The program is actually led by Dr. Jennifer Wiseman, who, if you do not know her yet already, she is a renowned astrophysicist, but also very well known in the world of science and religion. She's just a remarkable person to work under, so I encourage you to, she has some videos online, so if you want to hear her talk as well. But here I take a pause and kind of tell a little story again. So my parents, being parents, decided that when I joined AAAS, they're going to find out everything about it, right? But being first-generation Korean Americans, they decided to look this up in Google Translate and translate the AAAS website into Korean and look at what Dozer was all about. And so they look at the profiles of all the staff. So they started with Dr. Jennifer Wiseman. And read her name in Google Translate in Korean and read her prestigious profile. And if you can imagine, Dr. Wiseman, for somebody who studies stars and talks about science and religion, is a really good name. So if you didn't get wise man, stars, Jesus' birth, blah, 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 okay. So if you look at Google Translate, her profile says Doctor/Professor, the wise one in Korean, okay? And then they read all about her, and they're like, okay, let's look at our daughter. So they look up my name, and screenshot of this Google Translate. I kid you not. And that's really not what my name means, but it's interesting. It's very providential, maybe. Trust me, if you find a friend who speaks Korean, that's literally what it does. I put this slide up because it's a good reminder for me to ask you for your understanding, because this is a journey. This is a journey for me professionally, and it's also a journey for me privately as a person and a follower of Christ. And so it will continue to change and evolve, I'm sure, as I get older. So I'm just going to share with you where I am today, and just bear with me and keep that in mind for me as well. So this is where we're going. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about science and religion relationship in general, focusing on the conflict that we find in the landscape currently. Then I'm going to go a little bit into asking if there is a different way of seeing things, right? posing the question, can science go at it, meaning can science go at it in the world alone? Or even if, should it go at it alone? And then end with a call for the common good. So there's several ways that science and religion can interact, and there's volumes and volumes of books written by philosophers of science and religion that kind of dives into these types of different relationships. So this is a very cursory overview to these three types of relationship. Excuse me. The first is the contrast and independent model. And this is the idea that science and religion are really independent. They should stay independent, or they ask different questions. A big proponent of this was Stephen Jay Gould, who was a scientist who coined the term non-overlapping magisteria. So that kind of gives you an idea that their science and religion should not, are different and independent from each other. The second model is the contact model, and this can take many forms. It can take in forms of dialogue, integration, or collaboration. But the basic idea is that they somehow interact together, that they can work together, or maybe there are issues that overlap, and so forth. The third one, the question that's posed today, is one of conflict. The idea that science and religion are always at odds, they will continue to be at odds, and they should just, recognize that they'll never get along. It's important to note at this juncture that all of these categories are valid in terms that there are rational thinking ideas in many of these cases. And it's also important to note that depending on the science and religion issue at hand, they could also be a combination of these issues, as you can imagine. In some cases, one or the other. But I want to focus on the issue of conflict for tonight, since it's the focus for tonight. Why is there conflict? Well, the majority of the American landscape is religious, as you may have known. About 74%, according to a 2015 Pew study, has shown that Americans are religious, particularly in the Christian traditions. I don't want it to seem like we're picking on the Christian traditions themselves. It's just that there must be a recognition that large population of the U.S. public, it comes from that tradition, but other faiths as well. And so in light of this, Pew also did a study where they asked if the American public thought science and religion was one of conflict or one of that's compatible to each other. And as you can see, about 60% of the American landscape believe that science and religion are in conflict with one another. What's actually more interesting, I think, for this survey result is the next question. And they had asked, does science sometimes conflict with your own religious beliefs? And it turns out that many people don't think that it conflicts with their own religious belief. So this brings up the idea of perception. There is a perception that science and religion conflict in the world out there, but not for me, right? So this is very interesting. And so in order to dive a little bit deeper, AAAS did, as I mentioned earlier, a perceptions project to really understand the tensions between scientists and religious people. So all those questions before that Pew usually studies that we often hear about is science and religion in the context of science and religion just in general. But what we wanted to find out about was scientists and religious communities. Bring it to the people. What do the people think about each other? Again, it was a study in collaboration with Dr. Elaine Howard-Ucklin at Rice University. And we, again, asked the question between what do scientists and religious people think about each other. It turns out 20% of the general population, this is a survey of 10,000 Americans, perceives that tension between religious people, believes that there is a tension between scientists and religious people. So, and if once they dive in a little bit deeper into this, it turns out 20%, again, 1/5 of the population perceive hostility by religious people towards science, and vice versa, that they perceive hostility by scientists toward religion. When we look at the more conservative traditions in the American landscape, particularly the Perceptions Project was focused on evangelical Christian communities, these kind of numbers are actually quite higher. In the context going back to just the general thinking of science and religion, we found that evangelical Christians were twice as likely to agree that the relationship between science and religion is one of conflict, and if they had to choose, they would side with religion. And so this brings up the interesting dichotomy. Do we have to choose, right? It's not surprising that we're in a time of cultural conflict, right? And it may be because there are people out there that think that science is the sole arbiter of truth, that science will eventually answer everything there is to know in this world about meaning and purpose. And on the other hand, there are those in the religious communities that believe that are suspicious of science, or maybe not of science, but of scientists, right? And so I want to kind of challenge us today to kind of investigate this question: is there a different way of seeing things, right? And start off with the question that there are questions, and propose to you that there are questions, even in science, that science itself can't answer, and that we need these different types of voices. Francis Collins, Chaplain Huggins mentioned, is the current director of the National Institute of Health. He is also a Christian. He says, there are answers that science isn't able to provide about the natural world, the questions about why instead of the questions about how. And this stems very much from what an example that Polkinghorne, also, again, a physicist and an Anglican priest, had said in one of his books. He said, he boils water, and he has a friend coming over and asks him, and the friend asks him, why are you boiling? Why is the water boiling? Right? He has a pot of water boiling. And he said he can answer it two ways. One, he can say, well, the thermal, disclaimer, I'm not a physicist. Thermal energy of the water converts it to steam, blah, blah, blah. He can answer it that way, or he can answer it in terms of, I wanted a cup of tea, right? And so in this context, the two questions are very valid. They're valid questions, but they get at different things. And so this is kind of what Francis Collins is mentioning. So what are those kind of questions? Or what are those questions that we need answer to that science doesn't necessarily have the answer to? And these are questions about the ethical use of science, or the responsible use of science, or the responsible application of science. How should we do science, and how should we apply the science? Questions about purpose, about meaning. What is life? What is the meaning of life? Questions about significance. What is significant about being a human? What is significant about certain events in our lives, right? Even difficult and challenging questions like the meaning of suffering and pain in the world today, right? Questions about beauty and wonder. What is beauty? What is wonder? Why do we feel wonder, right? And so this is a park in Maine, Acadia National Park, and so this is a photograph. And as a Christian myself and a scientist, I wanted to just quote C.S. Lewis, who said when he was, this is in a reply to an essay about reason and faith. He says, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And so I wanted to take the time today to kind of pose to you the question, what does it mean to be human? And you'll see that at first glance, this could be a science question, but I really wanted to show you that as we start to peel the onion, it really could be more than a scientific question. So we're going to go and start with bacteria. So bacteria generally gets a bad rep. Here you see electron microscopes of tuberculosis, MRSA, which causes infection problems in hospitals, and cholera, which has historically caused a lot of problems. And it doesn't help that over time we've also seen a lot of newspaper articles and magazine articles that just create so much problems for people with illnesses and bacteria. So they do get a bad rep. But in recent days, there is what was discovered, the human microbiome. This idea that in addition to these bacteria that causes problems, there are these good bacteria that's on us and in us that is a part of us, right? The definition of microbiome is microorganisms and the genetic material in the particular environment, in this case on humans or in us. And you may have seen lots of commercials about yogurt, eat a lot of yogurt and eat more yogurt and those kind of things. It's actually a very simplistic way of thinking because it's, in this case, take it with a grain of salt because it's talking about one species. But really, when we talk about the human microbiome, It's all the different diversity of microorganisms, mostly bacteria, that's in our guts or that's on us, that's making us and contributing to our well-being. And in fact, science has recently, in the past decade, have discovered that they play roles in asthma, obesity, cancers, and even how patients respond to drugs. Certain drugs, because of the gut bacteria, won't respond as well. In addition, it has some important functions in brain, including anxiety, learning and memory, depression, autism spectrums, and other mental illnesses. And so it's important to say that they're really important. Okay, they play a very critical role in the well-being of humans. And so with that in mind, well, what does it mean to be human? Does it mean the cells then? So we compare the number of cells in the human versus the number of cells in the bacteria, and it turns out if you count all the number of cells in the human body, it turns out to be about 10 trillion. If you count all the number of bacteria on us and in us, it counts to be about 100 trillion bacterial cells. So if that means, does that mean you're 90% bacteria and 10% you? So what does it mean to be human? You're mostly not your cells, you're mostly bacterial cells. Right? So that shows us that we interact with our environment. We are just not human cells. So going from cells, and if we're not cells, if we're not human cells, what about our DNA? Are humans just our DNA? Does that define what a human is? So we're going to give you a little bit, dive into a little bit of a field that I studied, which was DNA. And so the central dogma of biology, as many of you, obviously all of you probably know, is DNA, genes, gets transcribed into RNA, gets translated into protein, they make up all the cells and the organs and us as you see, right? And DNA encodes all the information, the genetic material that are passed down, and encodes all of who we are as we know it into every single cell of our body. And if you and the DNA is all packaged tightly into a single cell. And if it turns out that if you unravel the DNA end to end, it turns out to be 6 feet in a single cell. So you can imagine 10 trillion cells with 6 feet times whatever. Again, I'm not a mathematician. It turns out to be hundreds and millions of miles long. I mean, it's a lot of genetic material in every cell. And so the question is, are we just our DNA then? What is it to be human? Are we just our DNA? Well, a field that I studied is what is called epigenetics. It turns out that in addition to the genetic material of DNA, which is the bases that you know of A, T, G, and C, there is something called outside. Epi means is a Greek root for outside or beyond. So epigenetics, something beyond the genetic code that we know of. And what this is these molecular markers on the DNA themselves, the little round balls. They don't actually look like that, obviously, but little things that you see. There are these marks on the DNA that contribute to how the DNA is packaged inside a cell. And this is the field that I studied. And just to break it down a little bit further, the best way to kind of envision how this all works is if you envision a gene structure in terms of a sentence structure. So genes form all that we know. We have about 20,000 genes in the human genome that kind of constitute all of us, each of us. And for each gene, there is like an on and off switch that tells the cell, okay, when to turn this on and when to turn this off. And this is the promoter or the enhancer section of the DNA. You can think of it as verbs and adjectives for a noun in a sentence. And it turns out that instead of just an on-off switch, it's more like a dial that kind of dials, like a dimming dial that turns on and turns off. And in addition, the epigenetic markers attach to the DNA such that it even further modifies that effect of turning on and turning off. And this is a very simplified illustration, but the bottom line point that I wanted to make is these epigenetic markers have been known to function in brain, which is the area of, I study neuroscience and epigenetics. And if you can imagine that they function in the brain, they function in learning and memory. So learning and memory is a process of how we take our experiences and how we record that and remember that, right? It's a collection of how we experience and interact with our environment. So this is a picture from obviously Inside Out, which how it shows how it goes from the character's short-term memory to long-term memory, which is actually quite well illustrated in that cartoon. So you can imagine that if it functions in our brain and it functions in our learning and memory and how we remember, it also turns out that it can be shared among family members or inherited, right? And it obviously affects our behavior. And in time, because it affects our behavior, it challenges, it kind of spurs us to do interesting things like dressing alike. So this is a picture from me in high school in which my uncle decided that we must all wear the same outfit. So you laugh, but I know that you all have some awkward family photo in your drawer somewhere. So here, but again, the point is that these epigenetic markers play a role in what is called transgenerational memory. So we had originally thought, scientists probably beyond 10 years ago had thought, oh, DNA does everything. DNA is inherited, and that's what the human is, and it gets transferred from generation to generation, and we share it with our ancestors. It turns out that epigenetic markers are also responsible for certain things that are passed on from generation to generation. And this is very interesting, particularly because in recent years there's been suggestions and research done in the area of trauma and experiences and memory, that in one generation, the trauma experienced by that one generation has actually effects on the well-being of generations later. This is phenomenal, right? This is an experience that one had experienced that's actually somehow has an outcome in their granddaughters and grandsons. So who are we, right? We're not our cells. We're not even in some ways our DNA. Maybe we're just epigenetic. I don't know. But it does bring up interesting questions, even in science, about who we are and how we came to be. So the third section is, then can science go at it alone, right? Should it go at it alone in terms of pursuing science or for humanity and so forth? And I bring up, I want to use another science example, in this case, gene editing. So in recent years, and this is quite literally very recent, in the past 3 years, there's been a phenomenal advancement in a technology called CRISPR-Cas9. And for the sake of time, I won't go into the technicalities, but if you're interested, it was formed by scientists over at Berkeley, Jennifer Doudna, as well as Feng Zhang over at MIT Broad Institute. Both simultaneously discovered it, and there's a lot of great TED Talks and YouTube Talks, one of which is here with Jennifer Doudna. Just Google, and you'll find it, and there's some really great videos of how this works. In short, CRISPR stands for Clustered Regularly Interspaced Palindromic Repeat. Scientists like acronyms. So I'll just call it CRISPR-Cas9. CRISPR-Cas9 is a system that was already in bacteria as a adaptive immune system response to when they're infected by viruses. And in this case, the scientists were able to re-engineer this system, this bacterial system that's already present, and re-engineer it to a very simple, elegant way to edit genes. And the best way to think about this is as a mechanism of cut and paste basically on your word processor, on Word. Just literally cut and paste. So you cut out the DNA that's causing problems and put in the DNA of choice that you would like. Right? And this is very powerful in terms of creating diseases that have a genetic component, like cystic fibrosis or muscular dystrophy, and many, many others. And it's not surprising. So in addition, it should be mentioned that genetic engineering or genetic modification of DNA or modification of DNA is not a new phenomenon. Scientists have known how to do this for decades. The thing about CRISPR is that it made the process very simple and very elegant and very easy to do and very fast. And so that brings up why in a lot of news today, you may have seen this, questions about can we edit our genes, right? The DNA revolution. And even questions about if we can replace things like our own, like bad genes, can we use it to enhance humanity, right? Editing humanity, designer babies is a term that many of you might have heard. And so it brings up a lot of ethical questions. Again, should science go at it alone? And there are questions in these forefront scientific advancements that science, I don't think, can answer alone. Questions like, should it be used for treatment of a patient or their future children? Is it a right or obligation to make choices for our future generation? Because obviously it will be passed down, right? Should it be used to enhance traits and not just cure diseases, like running faster or a particular hair color or eye color, or even cognition, right? Smarter. What are those traits? Is it fair for some to buy better genes than others? A social justice question. Does editing make them less of a person? Again, what is human? Or more of a product? Is this playing God, or is this fulfilling a God-given calling to serve humanity? And who decides? Right? Scientists know that this is not a question. Scientists themselves know this is not a question they can answer alone. And so there's a lot of text, but I bring this up because there was an international forum on this specific issue when CRISPR was discovered. And I just wanted to highlight the fact that in this report of this meeting in 2015, they said they call upon the national academies to really discuss this in a forum, and that conversation is inclusive among nations and engage a wide range of perspectives, including, as I highlighted there, faith leaders. Right. There was an update to this in 2017 recently, and it again explicitly says that this is a complex issue that requires technical, social, and religious concerns, and that, again, everyone needs to be involved in this conversation. So in these kind of cases, I want to quote Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who is a Jewish scholar who writes prolifically on science and religion. He says that science is about explanation, religion is about meaning. Science analyzes, religion integrates. Science breaks down to their component parts, things down to their component parts. Religion binds people together in relationships of trust. Science tells us what is, religion tells us what ought to be. Science describes, religion beckons, summons, and calls. So concluding with the call for the common good, where do we go from here? First, I think that we need to recognize that there are actually, the one thing I actually wanted to highlight, because of time I won't go into the other things that I've thought about, but the most important thing I think that I have learned over time is that we need to recognize common values. Science and religion, those who do science and those who do theology, share common values. And so this is a short video clip that was produced by AAAS for the purposes of kind of spurring this values like wonder and curiosity to be shared in classrooms. And it was particularly designed for seminary classrooms, but I think it's applicable anywhere. The scientists featured in this video are not religious, but they recognize the importance of engagement and why they do science. So I think it shows a very good idea of what spurs them to do research. So I think that video hopefully does a good job of showing what motivates scientists and what inspires them to do the science that they do, the research that they do. So here is a list of some of the common values that some scientists have cited. Things like curiosity and wonder you heard about in the video, humility, collaboration, courage to seek out those questions. What's striking to me is that a lot of those values are not just found in science, right? They're also found in religion and faith conversations as well, in the sacred texts. In the case of the Bible, it talks about many of those. Something that I remember, it talks about humility and perseverance, as many of you guys know, which I needed a lot in those experiments. Anyways, if you look at the thing of objectivity and even skepticism, and if you're wondering why that's even a biblical virtue, doubt no longer. Who is that? Staffel Thomas, right? And so I want to conclude by saying that this is a quote from a scientist that participated in a perceptions project, and the scientist had said, "The voices most often heard by the public are those seeking to emphasize a rift between science and belief, but the voices most needed are those recognizing the compatibility of the two." I was reading a little bit about Berry College and how it got started, and I saw that Miss Berry had said that she wanted to find a place and create a place with a commitment to head, heart, and hands. right? And I think it's very apropos in this case because the science and religion conversation engages the head and the heart, right? And I encourage those of you, not only those of you who are going into the sciences, but those who are going into philosophy or communications or any of the humanities, and those I haven't mentioned because I really am just science focused. But all the important majors, I mean, there's tons here, right? To engage both the head and the heart and ask what you can do with those hands. What can you do as you go forward in your education and in the years after Barry? And here are some resources. BioLogos, again, is a foundation. It's an organization committed to discussing harmony between science and particularly the Christian faith. I want to highlight the American Scientific Affiliation, for which I'm a member, and which is a network of scientists who are Christian. It's a fellowship also open to students. There are other organizations, and I just mentioned in different religious traditions, and I just mentioned Sinai and Synapses because we have a current project with them, but that's for the Jewish traditions. And organizations like Green Faith, Evangelical Environment Network, and others that particularly do a good job of demonstrating how scientists and religious leaders can come forth. In the case of Green Faith, it's a multi-interfaith kind of organization for the betterment of environment care and earth care and so forth. And of course, resources at AAAS, including those kind of videos, as well as reports from many of the projects that I talked about. So with that, I'm concluding, and thank you so much for your time, and I'll take questions.